No. Okay. All right. So I am really appreciative of the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon um, about the conduct of blood lead prevalence studies. So most of you know what lead does. This is basically my lead is bad for you slide. And the more lead you have, the worse it is. We pretty much demonstrated in Nigeria that the lethal dose for 50% of children who are untreated is somewhere between 100 and 150 micrograms per deciliter. Um, Okay, now, so we have not found a safe blood lead level in children. Every time we look and we think, well, it's got to be 10, or it's got to be 5, or it's got to be 2. And although when in this the effects of blood lead levels in those ranges are very, very subtle, at least at the population level, it is possible to see vast differences. So if you gave me 2 kindergartens. In kindergarten A, all of the children had a blood lead level of 3 or higher, and in kindergarten when they were 2. In kindergarten B, nobody did. I can tell you that the children in kindergarten B are going to be doing much better than the children in kindergarten A. But what I can't tell you is that Brett's not going to MIT because he's in kindergarten A, right? So it's hard. It gets hard, especially in low prevalence countries, to explain this kind of probability issue to parents. And my experience is that a diagnosis of a high blood lead level either comes with one of 2 reactions on the part of the parents: either outright terror and or everybody in the family has lead. So, but it's up to us to be able to help people think through this and understand and kind of look at the situation in a way that's really appropriate. So the other thing is that, as I said, unless we give chelation therapy to remove lead from blood, about 50% of children with blood lead levels around 100 micrograms per deciliter will die. And then finally, the economic costs to low-income countries in particular are staggering. And there's some work that's been done here in New York City by a group, Trisande and Company out of New York University. The website is there. You can go and look it up. But compare the effects of childhood lead exposure in the US or the EU and billions of dollars to that in low and middle income countries. And so it's just phenomenal about how much more they are affected. So today we're going to talk about 4 things, only 3 of which made it to this slide. Why do we want to conduct blood lead prevalence studies? I'm going to give you some examples of the kind of data that these studies can provide to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do them. I mean, you're not going to be able to walk out of here and just go conduct a lead prevalence study based on this. But and then finally, we're going to have, I hope, a discussion about how to decide what role blacksmiths should be playing in the terms of this kind of epidemiologic study design. Do you want to do it yourself? Can you contract it out? Can you partner? And so we can talk about how to do that and what the implications are of those choices. So you all know there are many sources of lead that can contribute to blood lead levels. Gasoline is not a major source almost everywhere. Battery recycling, I think on the international level, is probably the most prevalent high dose source for many, many children. But there's lead in consumer products, some of the traditional medicines, unregulated cottage industries, electronic waste recycling, which probably could just be lumped in with the battery recycling. There are special issues around child labor for these populations that are doing this. Localized sources such as mines and smelters, and increasingly internationally, lead paint. Now, we had a long discussion about this last night. So from my perspective, after 35 years in the lead poisoning prevention business in the United States, where most lead poisoning, defined as children with blood lead levels of 30 or 50 micrograms per deciliter, the source is lead paint in most cases in this country. And cleaning up the 100-year-old mess from lead paint in this country it's taken 100 years. You know, we're to the point now where in Boston, Massachusetts, kids from high-risk communities that are U.S. born no longer have blood lead levels of 30 and 40. But when I started in 1982, a blood lead level of 80 was not uncommon. It was actually quite usual in these neighborhoods. So, so we've managed to move this along. And when I think about how lead paint is coming onto the markets in these middle income countries who in the past have not been able to afford paint for housing or playground furniture, right, that they're going to create this mess that will then have to be cleaned up. I mean, for me, it's crazy making. It's like set your hair on fire time, because so while it's not the most dangerous source for these children right now, there is an opportunity here, and I'm appreciative of people who are working on it to prevent them from making the same mistakes that we made here in the 1910s and the 1920s. Okay, so that's a picture of a lady melting a motherboard, but it's underneath the thing. And this is Jakarta, Indonesia. This is one of the small battery recycling sites that we saw there. The advocates who work there tell me that they recycle 300,000 tons of lead acid batteries in Jakarta every year, or now in the surrounding areas. That's not a cottage industry, right? That's metals that get onto the metal markets that are somehow getting back into the stream. So, what can environmental lead sampling tell you? Well, you guys know this, the location of the contamination, and helps make it easier to map these areas and find the populations that have been most likely have been affected, who should have their blood lead levels tested, and provide the populations with the measures to reduce or stop exposure. You can also use these data to direct and evaluate remediation efforts. So sometimes we get criticized because the blood lead levels don't go down as dramatically as people would like them to see them go down after you do an environmental intervention. But if you lower the dust lead levels in the interior of a house by 10 or 50 times, that's an indirect measure of how things are more safe, not only for that child but for other children who will come into contact with it. So if you may get dinged on proposals because they'll say your outcome measure is an indirect outcome measure, but actually we know enough about how environmental lead affects children to know that once you reduce environmental contamination, you've made things better.
We weren't sharing the screen when we redid it, so the people on the phone, if folks on the phone, can you see the screen now?
Oh.
They could just hear you.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
That's great. Thanks, guys.
Do you see the full screen or just partial screen? Because then it's
The whole thing.
the whole thing.
I
Okay.
can see the screen now. Thanks.
Yeah, click on that bottom left presenter in the PowerPoint window. Just make it big again.
Right here? That one?
Yeah, that didn't work. No, stop connecting again. Okay, so we'll try that again. Sorry, guys. I'm sorry, Mike.
It's okay.
So I think maybe we can't do both then, I think. Share.
There's a couple interior stone walls in here that always mess us up.
So it looks good on behind me, right?
No, you have to share. Okay, showing main screen. Okay, can everyone online see the screen again?
Yeah, it'll be. Okay.
Okay.
No, let's just, yeah, Judith says we can, so that's great. Sorry, everybody.
That's it. Okay, so blood lead prevalence studies can link environmental lead sources, and this is the main point that I want to talk about today. So I'm going to show you some examples of lead paint in the United States and the tracking of national prevalence of blood lead from all sources in the United States, some of the stuff that happened in Nigeria, and then a negative study that we did in Puerto Rico. Because negative studies come with their own complications. And I'm not going to talk about this any further, but I happen to notice that there's an lead apportioning study title on the board, on the board here, and I want to talk about a little bit about lead isotope ratios. So these are the ratios of lead isotopes that are generally found in nature, and every mine has its own ratio, right? So every mine in the world will have a little bit different mixture of these ratios compared to someplace else, and that's something that public health people began talking about in the late 1980s, early 1990s, but the gasoline companies figured it out in the 1920s. So what they did was they mixed all their lead that they put into gasoline so they wouldn't leave a footprint on the environment, right? So that means that in the United States, it is incredibly difficult to try to do an apportionment study by using isotope ratios. It can work in Australia, and this is what happened in Nigeria. So if you look at the right side of the screen, you'll see all the people kind of clumped over together. Those are Nigerian children who have been tested, and those are their isotope ratios. There's some individual variation. And if you look over to the left, that's one of the health workers that was not Nigerian. And so he's got a totally different pattern. And the reason this was important to do at the time is because we didn't want people to say it's not the gold smelting that we're doing that's causing these deaths, it's the eyeliner, because there's lead in the eyeliner that's used in Nigeria, right? So you have to, so when you can do it, it's a really good thing to do, but it's a technology that didn't really live up to its promise, I don't think. So there are nearly 38 million housing units that contain lead-based paint in the United States, and this number has not moved a bunch, partially because we don't make housing lead-free in the United States, we make it lead-safe. And this is a decision that was made a long time ago based on both the expense of trying to take all this old housing down to the studs, because you have to replace the walls, you have to replace everything. And also because we have had really good success with making places lead safe. The problem that we have, and this happens at the Superfund sites with old mine tailings and things too, is that we have this tendency to think of it as one and done, right? So I go in, I de-lead a house. So in New York City, I do some stuff to the windows and I replace the doors and I make sure there's no loose and peeling paint and I'm finished, right? We can't do that. We have to understand that because we made this choice in the late 80s and early 90s, the downside from that is that you have to maintain this stuff. So we have to recognize there's a poison in our midst. And if you don't maintain that housing, you will have a problem in the future. 23 million housing units, or 25% of the nation's housing, have significant lead-based paint, and about 1 million of these have children with low-income children with under the age of 6. And if you look at this, well, the upper picture is a picture of a house that has lead paint. Hazards, as you can tell, because it's peeling, and the prevalence of lead paint housing is shown on the map, and it's very much a northeast phenomena, but it does stretch into the southern United States, into the deep south, where it's a whole different picture. The northern United States, it's rental properties, but in the southern United States, poverty is a rural issue. And it's usually grandma owns the house and nobody has done any maintenance on it since Papa died about 30 years ago. Yeah.
Jamie, a question, because I think we may get into this a little more.
Yeah.
Lead paint in the United States is largely related to drywall and plaster and wood.
Wood especially.
Wood especially.
Yeah.
But drywall and plaster. You go into the developing countries, we're talking concrete houses,
right,
particularly in the tropics, concrete houses and relatively less wood. And the remediation strategies that we've had, cover it up and take out the wood stuff, I suspect are going to be different in effectiveness in the concrete house world. The Has there been data on
No, not to my knowledge, there's any data. I mean, I think that would be a really interesting thing to take a look at and see if skim coating, is skim coating going to cover this up? Can you do it that way? It might be possible to take a look in Florida because they have that kind of housing there
Yeah.
too. And the other thing is the tile floors. There's a lot of lead in the tiles, and as those tiles are abraded, you're going to find lead hazards. So it's a little bit different. I'd still like to have them take the lead paint off the shelves. So this is some prevalence studies in the U.S. This is Detroit, in probably the 1990s. And the green dots are children with blood lead levels 5 to 9. The yellow dots are kids with blood lead levels 10 to 20. And the red dots are houses where there was a child with a blood lead level between 22 and 140, and where there has been more than one child, right? So what happened, we had pretty good laws on the books, but they were not usually enforced very well. And so what happened is that the houses became lead poisoned children incubators, because the programs would say, he's lead poisoned, I got to get him out of here, right? And so we move you out, and then you'd move in, right? So it would be, because poor people move every 6 months in this country. So, but you can see the number of, we call them repeat offender houses that we saw in Detroit. And this is this is Washington, D.C. And again, you can see the red dots are multiple offenders. And but you can see the clustering. You can see the geographic clustering. All of these areas had children, and all these areas had children that were being tested, because in Washington and in Detroit, the screening programs were very, very aggressive. So if there are dots, there are kids. But the clustering was, and then in Brockton, Massachusetts, this is something that I worked on. So this map shows you the main drag, Monticello Street, going up and down. You can see the clustering around it. That's 10 years worth of data. And I said to my boss one day, look, I don't need to test any more kids. Just give me a paint scraper, and I'll start at the top of Monticello Street, and I'll just take de-lead every house all the way down, and it'd be a lot quicker. I think the idea of me at the head of an army of de-leaders was more than he could take. And this is when we were talking about looking at the outcome of your stuff. So these green blocks here tell you when we got serious in this country about different lead poisoning prevention policies, beginning with the Lead Poisoning Prevention Act of 1971 and the phase out of leaded gasoline. And the phase out of leaded gasoline was a really, really good idea. So, but it's virtually eliminated by 1988. But it wasn't the only idea, right? Right after that, and even some of this other stuff that happened before that, blood lead levels continued to go down. So the average blood lead level of children in the United States in 1975 was about 17 micrograms per deciliter. In 2014, it was about 0.8 micrograms per deciliter, right? And I don't have the 2016 data here, but I can tell you I've looked at it and it hasn't changed. So there's something else going on, and I'm looking for somebody that's really good at biostatistics to help me figure that out. So let's take from the United States, let's go to Nigeria. So in 2010, we tested 119, surveyed 119 family compounds in Zamfara, Nigeria. In these compounds, these were polygamous families living in, so they had 3 or 4 women with multiple children. 26% of children less than 5 had died in the previous 12 months. There were families where all the children under 5 had died. 82% of these deaths involved convulsions. 71% of the households were processing gold ore inside the compounds, because they live under Sharia, so the women had never really had the opportunity to contribute to the economic development of their families. But they took these rocks and they put them in flour grinders, right? Gasoline generated flour grinders about like this, right? With the babies on their backs. And so they produce these enormous clouds of dust. And there was a lot going on there, at least the pathophysiology. I don't think we understand. We don't know a lot about babies inhaling lead dust that's that fine a particulate and the effects of acute lead poisoning, right? We know a lot about chronic lead poisoning in this country, but acute lead poisoning was kind of different. 97% of the living children have blood lead levels greater than 45, which CDC says is a threshold at which you should consider treating the child with chelation therapy. And the highest blood lead level that was reported was 700 in a living child with 700 micrograms per deciliter, and she was described as moderately affected. So I never got to see her. So this response, and John was certainly very, very important in this, involved defining the scope of the problem, cleanup sites, blood lead surveillance, medical management, and promotion of safe mining practices. I think we've done pretty well. We've defined the scope pretty good. The cleanup has progressed probably better than anyone initially expected that it would. Blood lead surveillance is kind of medical management. Doctors Without Borders has been fabulous in doing that. And the promotion of safe mining practices is really where we are today with trying to move this off the dime. And it's very, very difficult because these are subsistence miners. And as one of the fathers told one of the health workers, Nasser, he says, you tell me my children can die from lead poisoning. I will tell you my children can die from starvation too. So not to be thoughtful about it. And of course, the other guy said, look at my house. I used to have a thatch roof. Now I have a metal roof. I got a new wife. I went to the Hajj, So, they have things that they didn't have when they were making $2 a day or less. And you can kind of get a sense of some of the mapping stuff that was done on, this is Anka village, and to try to figure this out. So let's go now to Puerto Rico. A negative study is hard. It's easy to prove a positive, right? But to try to prove that something, not only didn't something happen, but it didn't happen because of something you did is really, really tough. So you have to have strong data to demonstrate the absence of a problem. In public health, we never want to have a false negative, right? We're okay with false positives. It's okay if I say, oh, I think maybe you have hypertension because your blood pressure was high today. Let's check it again in a month, right? So when I check it again in a month and it's not high. And so that's a false positive, right? But I don't want to say to you, oh, your blood pressure was wonderful. Don't worry about it. We'll check it again in 5 years, because maybe that was a false negative, right? So we're okay. So trying to get to make sure that you don't have a false negative is the goal, is what you want to think about when you're looking at a negative study. To do that, you need to consider all the possible sources of lead in the environment. And to do that, you need to have informants on the ground. For those of you that are working it's easy for me to tell you what the sources are for kids in the US, right? Soil, dust, water, traditional medicines and teas and spices and occupational exposures, right? And that's probably going to cover 95% of the water fund for lead exposures for kids here. That's not true in some of these other places. Nobody, until Nigeria happened, nobody ever heard of lead and gold traveling together in the mines. It was always lead and silver. So you can get fooled. The study design should be powerful enough to make sure that if there was a problem, you would have found it. And I'm going to give you some examples from Puerto Rico here. So this is a prevalence study of sampling in Puerto Rico. And we do this everywhere. Divide the island into clusters based on U.S. Census information. So those are the pink and blue blocks that you see here. So we know, the population in Puerto Rico is not evenly distributed over the island. It's like there's a whole bunch in San Juan and then some in these smaller places. And then in the middle, there's not if you've been watching the news with the storm and everything, you'll know that in the middle, there's not a lot of people there and it's very mountainous. So you use these clusters to develop strata based on the probability, and the probability is going to be the estimated size of the childhood population. So in this picture, yellow blocks indicate the number of children 0 to 5 years old. And then you go into each cluster and you randomly select within the cluster. So I might have a thing that says, okay, I'm going to take the first house, you generate these numbers, these series of numbers, and it's going to tell you randomly, take the first house, the 5th house, the 11th house, the 17th house, right? So you don't know what order it is. You're just going to go in and do this from a chart that's generated by a computer of random numbers. And each household with children in that yellow block has to have an equal chance of getting into the sample, right? Now, some people have a problem with this because they say, well, if I'm only going to do you and you and you and you, what about him and him? And, are they missing something? And we will probably get into this later on, but there's a couple of ways of thinking about this. The way that I do it is if we're in a neighborhood or we're in a house and somebody says, well, I knew you were coming to test my kids, so my sister brought her kids over. Can they be tested too? For me, the answer is always yes. Right? So if you come up to me, or what are you doing? Oh, my grandchildren are with me today. Can they be tested too? Yes. They're not part of the sample. They're not part of the data analysis, but they can have a test result, and you can give them the test result and the information and everything that they're supposed to get. Okay? That's the easy way to do it. You may be in a situation where resource constraints prevent that from happening, and that's what we'll talk about later. In this particular case, all eligible children in each selected household were enrolled in the study. There are some statistical things that you have to think about, whether or not you're going to enroll all the kids or you're only going to enroll one child per household. And you would have to consult with a statistician about that because there are pros and cons to each one. But again, if I'm going to do you, I'm going to test your blood, I'm going to test your little sister's blood. I just may not analyze her result. So this is what we found. There were 440 children in the sample. 97% of them had blood levels less than 5. And you can see what the range was. So the weighted prevalence, based on the probability of being in the sample for children with blood levels of 10, was 1%. And at the time this study was conducted in the United States, the prevalence of blood levels 10 or higher was about 0.9%. And then we looked at the environmental results, and you can see that we had no high soil samples if you use the EPA's action level. We had 3 or 1% of water samples that were above the action level. We had 1 dust sample that was above the floor sample that was above the 40 micrograms per square foot, and no dust window elevations. So this is pretty low environmental lead levels. So the conclusions were the prevalence among Puerto Rican children less than 6 was low and comparable to the U.S. estimate. There were very few environmental lead hazards identified in the household surveyed. And then finally, what we wanted to say was that carefully designed studies can reliably identify these communities. Now, I will tell you that during the process of conducting this study, we also went to the Head Start people and looked at their blood lead records and found that there were 3 children with high blood lead levels, which was really, that would be a lot for what we were experiencing in Puerto Rico. And what we found that they all had in common is that they had a parent or other adult living in the household who was working at the local lead smelter. And so then we used that information and went to the local lead smelter and tested all the people, and they were fantastically high. And they all had lead dust hazards in their housing because they didn't change their clothes or their shoes when they came home. So it was all this lead in the cars, all this lead in the houses, right? So there's two answers that come out of this study. One is that you have this information that says, most of these kids are okay. But the second is that there are environmental databases in the United States. One is called the Toxic Release Inventory. And the TRI, they had been violated by this battery recycling probably on average of once every 2 years. But it turned out that the people in the environmental management part of the territorial government didn't think that anybody in the health department would be interested in these data. Because I met with her and she said, "You really? Somebody over there wants to know this information?" So, we're not using. This is supposed to be where it's happening the best, right? We're not using all the information that's available to us. And as in the US, we look at lower and lower and lower prevalence rates, the thing we have to do is keep an eye on the environment using all these available data sets. We're not always going to have blood lead testing of kids to tell us what's going on. So now let's think about how would you do this. So you have to say, if you're going to do it, you have to think, what's the most rigorous scientific way I can approach this so that it's reliable and it's of value. I am asked to review probably 30 papers submitted to scientific journals a year, which are basically, I called the Magellan people who made lead care 2, and they gave me an instrument and some reagents, and I went and I tested my kids and the kids across the street and all the kids that came to my clinic on Tuesday, and now I have these blood lead levels, right? And so they want to publish this, and it's like, well, but I'm not really sure what they mean. I mean, I know what they mean for the individual, but I'm not sure that it has any relevance to the wider population because you didn't think about that part. The other alternative is I rented or I bought or I somehow got somebody to give me an XRF instrument for a little while, and I went and I tested stuff for lead, and guess what? Everything has lead in it, right? This has lead in it. The carpet has lead in it, but what does that mean? Does it mean anything for the health or blood lead levels of the people who are sitting here in this room right now? Probably nothing, right? So we need to do better than that, and in order for public health, but also because we need to really have valid data before we try to put in place a regulatory platform, right? Because the other guys know this too. What I'm telling you right now is no secret to the people who do not want to have a lead regulatory platform in place. So, okay, so everybody wants to determine if a specific lead source is contributing to blood lead levels in the population. We talked a little bit about why that's so hard. But if you find that the only lead source in the population is soil and air lead levels, and there happens to be a smokestack in the middle of town that's attached to a lead smelter, it's pretty easy to say it's more likely than not that is the source. Right? We want to determine the extent in the U.S. to the degree and extent to which lead paint is contributing to blood lead levels in the population. We would like to establish a baseline so when you do all this preventive work, you can show the impact of this work. And increasingly, I think you're going to find that your funders are going to be interested in knowing what was the outcome of the stuff that we gave you money and you did all this stuff and did help. And so you can demonstrate efficacy of preventive and regulatory action. And Haynes data that I presented with the graph with the regulatory things on it, I don't have to say very much more to a congressman or a senator, even a Republican one, for them to say, oh, yeah, well, we need to keep our eye on this lead thing. Yeah, that I'm convinced, right? So the possible outcomes of these studies are early identification and intervention for children with elevated blood lead levels. The blood lead levels that you see internationally that people get concerned about, 30 or 40, whatever's happened before a child whatever happened to a child's brain by the time he got to a blood lead level of 30 or 40 micrograms per deciliter is not going to be reversible by the medical therapy, nor is it going to be reversible by removing lead from his environment. But your goal is to keep it from getting worse. And your environmental remediation will do that. And early identification will do that. When the mortality rates in the field hospitals in Nigeria went from 47% of children who were admitted to those field hospitals to less than 1% in a week after we got the chelating agents into the site. So that's it. Those children still have terrible disabilities related to their former lead exposure, but we stopped the dying. Now, for blood lead levels such as those we see in the United States, and I was talking about the 2 different kindergartens, there are many factors that contribute to whether or not you're going to do well in school or whether or not you're going to be smart, right? So the first one is choose your parents well. If you were unfortunate in your choice of parents, there are other things that we can do. Like we can give you a good education, we can feed you well, we can make sure that you get enough exercise, we can give you interesting things to do. All of these things are going to improve your cognition, your thinking, and also improve your academic performance. Now, there is those of us, at least you and I, our blood lead levels were much higher than the rest of you. Right? We've had lives of at least modest success and enjoyment. How's it working out for you, John? Okay. And why is that? But we did get fed pretty well compared to what kids eat nowadays. And we did get educated pretty well compared to at least what kids get educated in big city school systems. And so we had all these other protective factors going on. And for kids in that range, I think that when you see them and their parents are hysterical, it's important to be very positive about how there is a bunch of stuff you can do. I know you're doing much of it already. You're doing all the things that Parent Magazine tells you to do to raise healthy and happy children, and those things seem to be somewhat protective. So you've got these kids on this end, and we understand that things are going to be very different for them in their lives. But then there are all the other children that you may be talking to, your neighbors or your sister or somebody like that, and those children, I don't think we give them enough credit for how plastic their brains are and how resilient they can be. The surveillance blood testing, if you keep track of these children over time, or the children in the neighborhoods over time, you can monitor the progress in the reduction of blood lead levels over time. Maybe you haven't been able to bring Lena's blood lead level down, but maybe, in 5 years, no child has a blood lead level that high. So that could be the way it works. We can develop and strengthen partnerships among agencies responsible for eliminating lead poisoning caused by lead paint or other exposures. And we can do research to improve prevention medicine. So if the lead paint issue on the cement block buildings has a different intervention, we can use this to figure that out, whether or not that works. The value of these local and regional blood lead studies is to identify high-risk groups. So the small area prevalence studies that we've been talking about will demonstrate, as I showed you with the maps from Washington, Detroit, and Brockton, Massachusetts, that lead exposure is inequitable in many communities. And that's true in the international arena too. And sometimes it's the rich people internationally because they were more likely to use the lead paint, or they're more likely to have access to these metals or specialties or whatever. We're going to develop capacity to respond to cases with elevated blood lead levels, and identify these inequitable hotspots so we can do primary and secondary prevention. So we can either remove the source before anybody gets hurt, or at least we can come in and control things to keep leads from going higher. And in the absence of national surveillance data, so we have a National Health and Nutrition Evaluation Survey in the United States, which is a population-based survey. The data I showed you on that chart is drawn from that, and it's done every 2 years. And, it's like scientifically bulletproof, and but many places don't have that and can't afford it. So having these small studies, which are much cheaper, costs us about $45,000 and takes about 3 weeks to do a prevalence study in a small like neighborhood area like in Jakarta and those 3 areas. So one of the reasons that it takes 3 weeks is unless you have special training at CDC, which I never had, you can't stay in a country for longer than 3 weeks. So you got a deadline, fast deadline. So they're useful to assess blood levels at population base and cross-sectional, so you can compare them. Right now, I can't say to you Detroit has a worse problem for lead than Flint, Michigan, right? Because of the way the blood leads are drawn. I don't know who got tested or why that person got tested or anything about what led to that testing, but I know it wasn't random. Right? So I can't tell you that. But if I did randomized studies in both of those places, and I could tell you what I sincerely believe in my heart is that, yes, the lead problem in Detroit is worse than the problem in Flint. It provides unbiased estimates. Connection lost.
It might come back. Yeah, restored. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, go away, little thing. There it goes.
Okay. Okay.
So say go away, little thing.
And because you do these studies with doing the environmental samples as well, it serves as a tool to understand some of the risk factors. And then finally, in every study that we've done, we worked with the local health people, and they told us something else they were interested in. They were interested in whether or not kids were immunized. So we added that. It's an easy question. They were interested in whether or not children were, were they growing properly? Were they the height that they were supposed to be or the weight they were supposed to be for their age? So that's an easy thing to add on. And when you do that, now all of a sudden I got a really great partner here. She's interested in nutrition. She wants to know, are these kids eating right? Are they growing right? And I say, okay, well, I'll give you this data, but I want you to come with me and help me, get folks enrolled in my study. In Puerto Rico, we found out that there are no smoke alarms or carbon monoxide detectors, which is a really big deal with all of these hurricanes, because we know that every time a hurricane or any kind of weather event happens in the United States, somebody will die because they put the generator in the house, because in poor communities they put the generator in the house so nobody will steal it. So if you want to do this, you need a statistician, right? You don't need to hire a statistician. You just need to go to some university around here someplace, where is Jack, and say, I need a statistician for 3 or 4 hours, and this is going to be a really wonderful experience for this person. They're going to love it, and we'll let them write a paper. Okay? You need to identify a specific target population or study area. So either you identify it, or after a while, as you're working with people, they identify it for you, right? They will come to you and say, we're worried about the excise factory in our Los Angeles neighborhood. Could you come out and take a look? You need to review the available demographic, census, and geographic data. So there may be some, there may not be some, and determine the necessary sample size. So let me go through this. I'm trying to keep my eyes on. So to do something, you have to have enough people in your study to be able to say that you were able to identify the issues that were there. And if you tell me which button to push,
it just comes and goes.
Just comes and goes? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that you want to know is, and we did this in Philadelphia. So go to this house, you go to house A, the house in front of you, and nobody answers the door. There's something peculiar about Philadelphia that most of the time people don't answer the door. Maybe Kevin can help us understand. I don't know. So go here, and they don't answer the door. So then you go to this store, then this people next door, and you go to this people next door. But you have to have some limited amount of information about this house, right? So you might know, because you have census data, you might know there was no children there. Or you might know it was vacant. If it's vacant, it's not really a non-responder. It's just there was nobody there, so I went to the next one, right? And so you have a protocol about what you do when there's nobody at the addresses of interest and how far out you can go from that place. And you go to the tax assessor's office and find out, is it a rental property? Is it when was it built? All that kind of information. So you can say that people that refuse to be in the study are like or dislike the people who are enrolled in the study. And you want to have the people that were not enrolled to be as much like the people who were enrolled as you can possibly be. So you want them to be the same race, the same age, the same language group, the same housing age, or whatever your factors are.
Jim, we have another issue.
No, I swear I'm not touching the wrong. I'm not. Is this why I don't use Macs?
Exactly my point.
I think it's frozen at the moment.
Well, while we're waiting, I have a question.
Sure.
So you mentioned the hypothetical classroom A and B.
Yeah.
One's got lead, one doesn't. You know, on average, we know the lead classroom's not going to do as well.
Yeah.
And then you added, of course, there's variability. There are some
Right.
protective factors
Right.
that affect individuals.
Yeah.
Are we able to quantify those protective factors? You know, what we sometimes call the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, or social determinants of health measures?
Right.
Or is it really just a general concept?
It's a general concept now. People are trying to think about that, and people are also trying to think about what would be the best interventions for these kids in terms of educational support. But nobody.
We don't have.
I think you could probably. I think you could probably sit down and look at the nutritional literature and probably figure out what the implications are of anemia, for example.
Okay. Right.
I think that there's probably some pretty good data there. But in terms of parenting style or, so I used to think that if you couldn't learn how to read, it didn't matter why you couldn't learn how to read.
Mm-hmm.
And so we would just give you the curriculum for kids who didn't know how to read, right? And then I was working with the educational community, and my colleagues said to me, there's a difference. So they said, if you have ADD, attentional deficit disorder, I'm going to say, Cody, you and I are going to work together on that. You're going to read this paragraph. I'm here for you all the way. We're just going to work so hard, and I know you're going to be so proud of yourself, right? Mm-hmm. If you have traumatic brain injury and you're struggling with the paragraph, I say, maybe you need a rest. Maybe just need to lie down a little bit, take a little easy, or would you like to go out in the swings or take a walk? And when we come back, you'll be able to read the paragraph. So it's not necessarily a different curriculum, but it is certainly a different delivery system, right? And we don't know that about life. Yeah. So if there are people who are interested in getting a PhD, that would be the study. That's my vote for your study.
If I could add to that.
Yeah.
So our experience in the field when we get into these education components and parenting components, often in the developing world, we're dealing with poorly educated or illiterate people.
Right.
And as we saw in Nigeria, and we've seen in a bunch of other places, we try to